The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order without objection. The chair may declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to examine the growing cyber threats to our homeland, the actors, the tactics, and the trends. Specifically, we're going to delve into the risk posed by the People's Republic of China, which has burrowed into our critical infrastructure and compromised our telecommunications networks. We will also discuss the threat posed by our other three nation-state adversaries who leverage cyberspace: Russia, Iran, and North Korea. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. Now that we are officially organized as a committee, I'd like to welcome everybody to the 119th Congress, or as we were discussing a little earlier, the 119. We have lots of work to do to support and secure the homeland, and that is why cybersecurity is our top priority. And it is why the topic of our first full committee hearing is cybersecurity. In today's interconnected world, virtually every aspect of American life is impacted by cybersecurity, from our nation's healthcare system and water supply to simple internet browsing. Cyberspace is increasingly becoming a digital battlefield. America's adversaries use cyberspace to undermine our sovereignty and threaten the services and infrastructure that America depends on. The People's Republic of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and criminal actors weaponize cyberspace to harm our nation. They are only getting more sophisticated and unfortunately more aggressive. Right now, the PRC is burrowed into our infrastructure. Let that sink in for a moment. China is pre-positioned in our infrastructure. We know it, and they have been for years. Should we enter into a conflict with the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party is ready to shut down our essential services, our communications, our energy grid, our maritime ports, and our water systems, to name just a few. We cannot allow this situation to continue. The American economy, our government, the military depend upon the resilience of our networks and our infrastructure. It's past time for us to get a step ahead of the typhoons, a list of actors that seem to grow every day. We've played defense far too long, and now it's time to go on the offensive. To do this, we need prepared cyber professionals. I know that some of these nation states' issues go beyond what our current cyber defenders can address. And this is why one of my top priorities this Congress is to pass the Cyber Pivot Act, which cultivates the cyber workforce we need at scale. We passed it out of this committee unanimously last year, and this year we hope to get it signed into law. We also need a coordinated whole-of-government effort that can rapidly share information with the private sector. Since the private sector owns and operates most of the critical infrastructure in the United States, the collaboration of the organizations our witnesses represent today is essential. I look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses about how we can improve public-private partnerships for cyber and critical infrastructure issues. So far, I've focused on one threat actor, arguably the one that poses the greatest risk to the United States in cyberspace and beyond. However, there are many other threats that we must be prepared to address simultaneously. For example, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has targeted our elections, notably hacking the Trump campaign in the 2024 cycle. It has also repeatedly tried to compromise U.S. water and waterway systems. The intelligence community indicates that Moscow uses cyber disruptions to influence the decisions of countries like the United States. North Korea is a major culprit of cybersecurity and cyber crimes as well. To devise strategies to address these challenges and threats in cyberspace, we must better understand them, and that's what we're doing here today. Our witnesses will provide the insights we need to think critically about tackling current and emerging cyber threats to our homeland. All witnesses are private sector leaders, three of whom bring key insights from their government experience. Thank you all for being here to set the scene for us as we dive into the 119th Congress. I look forward to the discussion and to a productive Congress of enhancing our cybersecurity posture. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today marks the committee's first hearing, as you've already indicated, of the 119th Congress, and the first hearing the committee will hold during the new Trump administration. I'm encouraged by the chairman's interest in devoting more of the committee's time to cybersecurity this Congress. That said, I'd be remiss if I did not express concern about what we will be able to achieve. Over 6 years ago, bipartisan members of this committee came together to support legislation authored by then Chairman McCall to establish Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, now commonly referred to as CISA. When he signed the bill into law, President Trump said, and I quote, "As the cyber battlespace evolves, this new agency will ensure that we confront the full range of threats from nation states, cyber criminals, and other malicious actors, of which there are many," unquote. With the apparent support of President Trump, members of this committee worked together to pass legislation authored by both Democrats and Republicans to ensure CISA had the resources and authorities it needed to carry out its important federal network and critical infrastructure mission. Unfortunately, driven by false allegations and conspiracy theories, President Trump and many Republican colleagues have soured on CISA. Less than a year ago, over 100 of them voted to cut CISA's funding by 25%. Some of the loudest and most influential voices on the other side wanted to eliminate CISA entirely. So even relatively minor bills that touch CISA have been difficult to advance. I'm hopeful that the committee's focus on cybersecurity this Congress will help members understand that CISA does what CISA does and does not do, so we can return to our bipartisan work of making the digital ecosystem safer and more secure. Bearing that in mind, we have to be clear-eyed about the enormous task ahead. Cyber attacks from China, Russia, Iran, and cyber criminals are growing bolder and more prolific. Last year, former FBI Director Christopher Wray warned that Chinese threat actors like Vote Typhoon pose an imminent threat to the U.S. critical infrastructure because they are pre-positioning to physically wreak havoc on our critical infrastructure at a time of its choosing. Preparing critical infrastructure owners and operators to defend and build resilience in PRC-sponsored cyber attacks requires consistent investment in CISA's program. And that is to say nothing of its work to help private sector defend against the espionage threats posed by Salt Typhoon and Silk Typhoon, or the threats posed by other adversaries. During the 116th and 117th Congress, this committee worked on a bipartisan basis to right-size CISA's budget so it would be well positioned to defend federal and critical infrastructure networks against these types of urgent threats. In fact, in 2020, the top Republican on the committee advocated that CISA should be a $5 billion agency by 2025. So I was troubled by DHS's Secretary nominee's testimony last week that she wants a smaller CISA because it's gotten far off mission. Although it was not entirely clear what she meant by that comment, committee Democrats will oppose any effort to shortchange CISA's mission or its workforce. The Biden-Harris administration left behind a solid foundation for improving the nation's cybersecurity that the new administration can build upon. Its national cyber strategy put the country on path to reduce cyber risks systematically by shifting the responsibility for security away from our constituents and onto technology manufacturers, and by incentivizing the adoption and integration of better security practices. Its executive orders on cybersecurity modernized the federal government's approach to securing its own networks, sought to address supply chain and third-party risks, and harnessed the security benefits of new technologies. For its part, CISA launched the successful state and local cybersecurity grant program, led efforts to improve the security of the technology we use through its Secure by Design program, and began to mature its operational collaboration activities through the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. The new administration should not reverse course on this hard-earned progress. Before I close, I'd also like to express my concern regarding the dismal dissemination of government members of dismissal of non-government members of advisory committees inside the department, including the Cyber Safety Review Board and the CISA Advisory Committee. The CSRB is in the process of investigating the Salt Typhoon hack of 9 major telecommunication companies, and it is a national security imperative that the investigation be completed expeditiously. I'm troubled that the president's attempt to stack the CSRB with loyalists may cause its important work on the Salt Typhoon campaign to be delayed. The American people deserve better. With that, I thank the witnesses for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today, and ask that our witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and thank you. You may be seated. I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Mr. Adam Myers currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Counter-Adversary Operations at CrowdStrike, where he leads the company's threat intelligence line of business. He also oversees the development and deployment of AI, machine learning, reverse engineering, and other technologies to detect suspicious and malicious cyber behavior. Before joining CrowdStrike, Mr. Myers was the Director for Cybersecurity Intelligence at SRA International. Mr. Mark Montgomery. Mr. Mark Montgomery serves as the Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology and Innovation at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. Mr. Montgomery also directs CSC 2.0, an initiative that works to implement the recommendations of the congressionally mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where he serves as an Executive Director. Previously, Mr. Montgomery served as Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee. He served in the United States Navy for 32 years as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, retiring as a Rear Admiral in 2017. Mr. Brandon Wales. Mr. Wales serves as Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Centennial One. Before his current role, Mr. Wales served as the Acting Executive Director of CISA, where he supervised the agency's operations and spearheaded its long-term strategy development. Mr. Wales was also appointed Senior Response Official leading the domestic preparedness and response concerning the crisis between Russia and Ukraine. He spent almost 15 years at DHS in various leadership roles. Ms. Kimba Walden. Ms. Kimba Walden serves as the President of the Paladin Global Institute, which was founded to bring the private capital perspective into technology policy. Previously, she served as the Acting National Cyber Director and was ONCD's inaugural Principal Deputy. Prior to ONCD, Ms. Walden served as Assistant General Counsel for Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit. She has over a decade of experience at the Department of Homeland Security. I thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and I now recognize Mr. Myers for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Adam Myers, and I serve as Senior Vice President for Counter-Adversary Operations at CrowdStrike. For over a decade, I've led the company's practice area, monitoring and disrupting cyber threats. Today, I will share insights into the global cyber threat landscape and highlight steps we can take to strengthen our collective defenses. As a leading U.S. cybersecurity company, CrowdStrike has a unique vantage point, which gives us unparalleled visibility into adversaries' evolving tactics and allows us to see the full scope of the threats facing our nation. After over a decade of investing in programs to strengthen their cyber capabilities, China has matured to achieve at least parity with other world cyber powers. They now possess a sophisticated and highly effective offensive cyber capacity targeting every region and every industry vertical across the globe. Recent campaigns demonstrate the ability to compromise large, well-resourced, and well-defended enterprises, operating as providers for the rest of the technology ecosystem. One indicator of this maturation is recent Chinese operations aimed at conducting upstream or bulk collection and subsequent downstream targeting of US political and national security officials. Some notable China Nexus adversaries we've observed recently include Vanguard Panda, also known as Volt Typhoon, Operator Panda, which likely overlaps with an actor elsewhere reported as Salt Typhoon, and Liminal Panda, which heavily targets telecommunications and critical infrastructure. Some campaigns are suggestive of pre-positioning capabilities, which could be precursors for disruptive and destructive cyber attacks. Over the past year, cyber nexus intrusions increased 150% across all sectors on average compared to 2023. These increases were most significant in the financial services, media, manufacturing, and industrials and engineering sectors, which all experienced between 200% and 300% increases compared to previous years. Beyond China, other threats continue to evolve. North Korea has engaged in significant financially motivated threat activities since at least 2015. Recently, they've exploited numerous US companies by pursuing remote working opportunities, earning a paycheck while occasionally stealing intellectual property. Russian Nexus adversaries continue to prioritize intelligence collection against Western military, political, and diplomatic entities, with their operations heavily influenced by the war in Ukraine. These actors have evolved their tactics to target mobile devices, reflecting a need for battlefield intelligence. In 2024, motivated by ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, Iranian Nexus adversaries continued to extensively target Israeli entities. One threat actor, Charming Kitten, collected intelligence on regional policy experts, while others conducted destructive operations and information operations. They've also begun leveraging artificial intelligence to enhance their capabilities, including vulnerability research and exploit development. From a criminal perspective, ransomware threats continue to impact all geographic regions and industries. Hacktivists, for their part, continue to grow in sophistication and also increasingly engage in for-profit e-crime in addition to pursuing social, political, and terrorist agendas. The cyber threat landscape is complex, dynamic, and increasingly interconnected. Adversaries are constantly refining their tactics to exploit vulnerabilities across industries and sectors. To counter these threats, we must raise the cost of cyber attacks and reduce their impact. This requires investment and a collaborative effort across government, industry, and the cybersecurity community. I recommend that enterprises must take steps to defeat the threats I've outlined today. These include strengthening identity protection, such as through identity threat detection and response, enhancing enterprise visibility through endpoint detection and response, and integrating detection and telemetry data through next-generation SIM capabilities to enable proactive threat hunting. The federal government can enhance national security by doing cybersecurity well, adopting best-in-class technologies, and more consistently disrupting adversary infrastructure. With respect to the latter, recent coordinated operations have degraded threat actor capabilities. We need to increase the tempo of these operations. For Congress's part, it's appropriate to perform oversight to ensure federal agencies are actively pursuing the objective outlined above, as well as ensuring resource alignment and accountability. Further, it's worth contemplating the use of tax credits, rebates, and other incentives to make best-in-class cybersecurity tools and training more accessible. As the federal government takes on initiatives to modernize and create efficiencies during this period of transition, as well as review and deprecate legacy programs and systems, there's a significant opportunity to move the needle in each of these areas. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. I now recognize, I guess it's Rear Admiral Montgomery.
Yes, sir, Rear Admiral Montgomery. Yes.
For 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, members of the committee, for inviting me here today. Since 9/11, every president has stated the defense of the homeland is the nation's #1 priority. And despite this attention, as President Trump takes office this week, the homeland has never been less secure. While America does remain at risk from physical attack by terrorists and even missile attacks from Russia and China, the most persistent vulnerability is the threat of cyber attack. And make no mistake, China is America's most capable and opportunistic cyber adversary. Look, China's not alone. As was mentioned, Russia, Iran, North Korea, criminal actors, they all had banner years in 2024, penetrating U.S. networks, conducting espionage, extorting ransom, stealing sensitive data. But of greatest concern to me is China's Volt Typhoon operation, which involves Chinese hackers installing malware within infrastructures. This malware lies in wait, ready to disrupt and destroy U.S. systems at a time of Beijing's choosing. This campaign penetrated numerous critical infrastructures in the United States, including ports, energy systems, and water utilities. As a military planner, I used to call this operational preparation of the battlefield. China's overarching goal in executing an operation like Volt Typhoon is to disrupt or degrade America's rail, port, and aviation systems so that the U.S. cannot rapidly mobilize military forces and get military equipment, personnel, and supplies to the battlefield. And addressing these cyber vulnerabilities is going to be really challenging because the Defense Department does not control the infrastructure on which military mobilization depends. Instead, the U.S. military relies on 18 commercial ports, 70 civilian airports, and 40,000 miles of commercial rail lines. That's how we move our troops and our equipment overseas. And these systems are largely owned by the private sector and local governments, and they're often maintained with insufficient levels of cyber resilience. To make matters worse, the energy, financial services, and manufacturing industries that drive economic productivity in our country, and the water, food, and healthcare systems that keep Americans alive, they're all equally vulnerable to this cyber attack. And both nation states and criminals out for a quick payday take advantage. And while the private sector does own this critical infrastructure, and they've definitely not done enough to invest in cybersecurity, the U.S. government is also at fault for its poor performance as a partner to the private sector. And many of the federal agencies that are responsible for what we call the public-private collaboration, some are even uninterested, and many of them are under-resourced in the mission. So I think as we look for solutions, the key challenge for the United States is to restore deterrence in cyberspace, making it too hard or too painful for an adversary to disrupt or exploit our networks and systems here in the United States. To do this requires both deterrence by denial, improving our defensive efforts, and deterrence by punishment, which is improving our ability to impose costs on an adversary overseas. In my written testimony, I provide 8 recommendations, but I just want to highlight 4 of them here, given the time constraints. First, we need to secure the critical infrastructures that support military mobility. We have to address the vulnerabilities in aviation, rail, and port infrastructure, and ensure that the Coast Guard, TSA, and FAA have the necessary authorizations and appropriations to execute their missions. And the private sector operators of these systems will need technical and financial assistance to combat the Chinese cyber attacks and ensure the availability of essential services in a time of crisis. Second, we gotta prioritize assets. The United States cannot protect everything everywhere all at once. Within critical infrastructure, there are assets and entities that are more critical to U.S. national security. These assets need priority access to intelligence and incident response support. In return, the American people should expect these assets to practice a higher level of cybersecurity. Third, we need to better utilize the National Guard to defend our critical assets. The Guard uniquely bridges military and civilian sectors, as well as federal and state government authorities, making it ideally suited to respond to a domestic cyber threat. The Congress should work with the Department of Defense to determine the Guard's long-term role in the cyber protection of critical infrastructure and identify any new necessary authorities, which I don't think are many, and resources, which I think will be many, to do this. Finally, we have to recruit and develop an effective government cyber workforce. We need to hire more talent for federal, state, and local governments. We need a program that focuses on hiring graduates from vocational schools and community colleges, where students can earn skills and certifications. The Cyber Pivot Act from last Congress answers this challenge and should be re-attacked this Congress. In the past, the United States has had the luxury of thinking about how to handle a threat from an adversary state over there, in their backyard. Things are different today. To make America secure, we'll have to make the investments in cybersecurity and critical infrastructure that America has postponed for far too long. Again, thank you for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on global cyber threats, a subject that I've spent nearly 2 decades focused on in government service and in the private sector. The past few years of publicly acknowledged intrusions by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and cybercriminal organizations make clear that the U.S. is facing increasingly sophisticated adversaries in ongoing cyber warfare. The intensity of that threat is at an all-time high, driven by a combination of increased geopolitical tensions and the rapid pace of technological change, and it shows no signs of abating. Defenders in both the government and the private sector are learning from each breach. However, threat actors are also evolving and innovating. Maintaining a strategic edge and building national cyber resilience remains a critical challenge and will require new thinking across the public and private sector. Among the various cyber threat actors, the People's Republic of China stands out for its persistence, breadth of operations, and capabilities, and I'll focus the remainder of my testimony here. The threat posed by the PRC is nothing new. In 2007, they stole the plans for the F-35. In 2010, they compromised Google. In 2015, they hacked OPM, and the list goes on. As a result of these and other unprecedented attacks, Presidents Obama and Xi negotiated restrictions on cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. However, in the wake of that 2015 agreement, the PRC retooled, they reorganized, and now they are more dangerous than ever. According to the FBI, their hacking program is now larger than every other major nation combined. And over the past 2 years, the extent of their strategy has become alarmingly clear. In 2023, Microsoft and the US government uncovered that Chinese actors associated with the People's Liberation Army were pre-positioning on US critical infrastructure, preparing to launch disruptive or destructive attacks during a crisis or in the prelude to war. That summer, Chinese actors compromised Microsoft signing keys, granting them access to nearly anyone's email on Microsoft Exchange Online. Late last year, it emerged that Chinese Ministry of State security actors had breached major US communications companies. The PRC's objective is unambiguous. They are preparing for war on the networks of America's businesses, infrastructure, and government agencies. Their goals are to prevent the United States from defending its partners and allies by disrupting our ability to project power into the Pacific, and to weaken America's resolve by causing societal chaos inside the homeland. Our response must be equally clear-eyed through a whole-of-society effort that combines government resources, authorities, and expertise with private sector innovation, insights, and reach, all underpinned by the support of the American people. Which brings me to a series of recommendations. First, the federal government should continue strengthening and centralizing critical cybersecurity capabilities within CISA, streamlining regulatory oversight of industry, and regulating smarter rather than simply more. Additionally, the government must fully leverage its tools alongside those of our partners and allies to disrupt and deter adversaries wherever possible. Second, business leaders, particularly in our nation's critical infrastructure, need to understand that the government cannot save them from all threats. Cyber risks are core business risks, and therefore companies are ultimately responsible for their security and resilience. More importantly, if they are not already preparing for a crisis with China, they're late. Third, the government, industry, and the public must collectively demand more from technology product and service providers. We cannot secure our diverse infrastructure one system at a time unless the technology we depend on is secure by design, by default, and in operation. We will remain at the mercy of our adversaries. Finally, we must be transparent about the sources of the cyber threats we face. Vague terms like typhoon or panda are fine for internal actor tracking, but in the broader public discourse, they obscure rather than clarify that foreign military and intelligence agencies are actively planning to attack systems critical to public health, safety, security, and economic well-being. Calling these actors by name is essential to fostering public understanding and engagement. And time is not on our side. President Xi has instructed the PLA to be ready to militarily retake Taiwan by 2027. This means the US government, industry, and allies have only 2 years to prepare. To that end, the actions of the 119th Congress could prove among the most consequential in modern history. I applaud the committee for prioritizing this issue first, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wells. I now recognize Ms. Walden for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify today on this important topic. I'm Kemba Walden, president of the Paladin Global Institute and co-chair of the Aspen Digital U.S. Cybersecurity Group. I'm here today in my personal capacity, drawing from my experience as former acting national cyber director and my roles at Microsoft and at the Department of Homeland Security. The last 4 years have seen new sophisticated cyber threats, each of which has highlighted why cyber remains a significant source of human-caused risk to our homeland. We saw the 2020 Russian attack on the SolarWinds Orion platform, and then the 2021 ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline. And then in 2022, the first shots fired in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine were from a cyber attack targeting an American satellite communications company. Each of these incidents represents a clear national security threat in their own right. And I haven't even mentioned the Microsoft Exchange server debacle, Log4j, or the billions of dollars spent in the aftermath of Change Healthcare. Yet there are 2 campaigns in the past 4 years that I hope the committee will focus its attention on. The first is the recently uncovered targeting of our nation's critical infrastructure by the People's Republic of China. This activity, dubbed Volt Typhoon, represents a step change in the PRC's cyber operational capability, demonstrating their willingness to pre-position in our critical infrastructure in preparation for a future conflict. Second, we've now witnessed the PRC snooping on our telecommunications networks. Salt Typhoon shows the PRC investments are paying off in truly a scary fashion, as they have accessed the beating heart of the internet itself. I raise these 2 examples to highlight the stakes we face. The PRC's capabilities are rapidly improving, and we have seen from their behavior that they are ready to use cyber tools to attack our critical infrastructure. But despite these threats, there are key steps that Congress and the new administration can take to increase our resilience and improve the nation's cybersecurity posture. We must strengthen national cybersecurity by clarifying roles and responsibilities of the private sector and government, upskilling our collective workforce, and embracing technological innovation. On the first, the roles and responsibilities front, there are 3 legislative actions that I would offer as low-hanging fruit for you to consider. The Cybersecurity and Information Sharing Act of 2015 expires in September. This committee must take action to reauthorize that legislation to ensure we do not see hard-won progress lost to congressional inaction. I also urge the committee to further clarify liability protections related to the defensive measures to allow for the most proactive defensive approach possible. Regulatory harmonization is an enormous challenge that places an untenable burden on business while harming our cybersecurity. Last Congress, Senator Peter, Senator Langford, and Congressman Higgins introduced legislation to help bring coherence to the multitude of federal regulatory approaches by empowering the National Cyber Director, and Congress should move swiftly to reintroduce and advance this important bill. This committee should also work to codify the Cyber Safety Review Board, or CSRB, which helps to understand the root cause of cyber incidents to keep us from making the same mistakes over and over. I hope you will consider strengthening the board by making it full-time, independent, and nonpartisan with its own administrative subpoena power. Of course, all the policies in the world are meaningless without the workforce implementing them. While there are several successful programs that are helping to put a dent in the hundreds of thousands of unfilled cyber jobs we have in this country, there is absolutely more we can do. To remain sustainable, Congress should expand CISA's current cyber workforce programs, increase the number of internships and apprenticeships available to qualifying students with or without college degrees, and provide incentives for cyber professionals to work at under-resourced targets like hospitals and water systems. Finally, I urge you to embrace technology, including from venture-backed companies that are truly at the cutting edge, and allow it to be part of the solution. Supporting the use of artificial intelligence, for example, for threat detection and response, can help neutralize sophisticated cyber threats more efficiently. Distinguishing between our digital presence, knowing who's who and that you are you, is of paramount importance to cybersecurity, for the federal government must update its digital identity guidelines to prevent unauthorized access, phishing, and email-based attacks, and decrease cyber fraud of public benefit programs. In conclusion, the global cyber threat landscape requires a coordinated, proactive approach, combining legislative action, technological innovation, and operational collaboration. Acting together, we can protect our national security interests while fostering innovation and economic growth. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Walden. Members will be recognized in order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. I want to remind everyone to please keep their questioning to 5 minutes. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Over the last year, the U.S. government has discovered a number of PRC state-sponsored threat actors deeply embedded in and across the nation's critical networks. Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, and most recently Silk Typhoon have compromised our critical infrastructure, hacked sensitive communications, breached federal workstations, et cetera. I appreciate Mr. Wales' comment about these names seemingly masking the real true identity of the threat, and I take that to heart. We need to call China out aggressively on this. It's alarming that most of our critical infrastructure systems have been violated right under our noses. Mr. Myers, can you explain the PRC's playbook on how each of the Typhoon operations, or how China's cyber war against the United States is, how they're doing it?
Thank you, Chairman. China has engaged in, as I mentioned, a maturation in how they conduct these operations. Today, they're using exploits that target external-facing devices that are connected directly to the internet, that effectively bridge enterprises to the internet. These devices are often unmanaged. In many cases, they may be legacy or have proprietary capabilities. That means that they don't run modern security tools. And China's also nationalized.
Can you give an example of one of those? Like, are we talking about a Fitbit on your wrist, or I mean, what are we talking about?
Sure, like a router or a VPN concentrator, things that are meant to connect the enterprise to the network or allow remote users to authenticate in are some of
the
the
nodes, so to speak, between silos.
Yes, sir.
Got it.
And these are highly prioritized and highly valuable targets for these threat actors. They've nationalized their vulnerability research program. In 2018, for example, they changed the national security law in China, and all vulnerability research has to be submitted through the Chinese government. Whereas here in the United States, we follow something we call responsible disclosure, where if I find a vulnerability in a product, I notify that product vendor in order to try to get it fixed. They're effectively nationalizing that resource so that they can use that for exploits against American technology and American companies. Once they gain that access, they attempt to remain stealthy and either conduct espionage in order to inform political and military decision-making, or in the case of Vanguard Panda, also known as Volt Typhoon, the pre-positioning that we've discussed here, which would be potentially useful to bring down some of these networks that Mr. Montgomery mentioned in time of conflict.
One of the questions I have of all of you, and I'm not going to ask for an open answer today, but I'd like to ask if in writing, I think that's something that's really important. And on my to tackle this Congress list. I want to ask, I only have a minute, Rear Admiral Montgomery, you mentioned the National Guard and their importance in the defense of the nation. One of my National Defense Authorization Act amendments last cycle, I'm going to bring it forward again this cycle, is to put a cyber defense unit, National Guard unit, in every state. As much to help, our own national defense, but really because the states can then, put those guys on Title 32 and use them in the event that, because our local governments and our states are getting hammered just as much as the federal government is. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that while I had a few seconds.
Yes, sir. Well, I agree, and I agree for several reasons. One, governors have authorities that at the state level that the federal government doesn't have. So it actually having them local like that's good. Two, they have relationships within the community already. They come from companies there. And I do think you need it widespread because a state will lend, disaster response to a state 6 or 7 states away because they can look at a weather map and say, I'm not going to have the same event. But if a cyber event starts to unleash itself, governors are not going to be that comfortable lending their limited cyber capabilities to a state that doesn't have them. So I do think there's value in having a more robust National Guard capacity, and having it across all 50 states and 4 territories is probably the right answer.
Thank you. My time has expired, and I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I applaud your effort on identifying cyber security as a critical area for this committee to look at. And if I would capsule the testimony, we do have a problem. The question is, are we addressing it in the best manner? One of the things we did was create CISA as part of the fix. I guess the question is, do you see a continued role for CISA? And is there some other roles that CISA might play, since that's kind of where we are today? And I'll start with you, Mr. Myers, and we'll kind of go down.
Thank you, Ranking Member. We would happily work with any federal agency that is charged with securing the cybersecurity of the United States. As far as which agency is appropriate, I defer to the federal government on that one.
I do believe that we need a CISA, and the specific one that you all have authorized. You've worked the last 4 years to modify CISA's actual authorities year after year. I do think I'd like CISA to focus on their role as the risk manager for the country. In other words, bringing together risks from all the different sectors and understanding which are the #1 risk areas that we need to address. I've pointed out rail, ports, and aviation. That cuts across multiple federal agencies. So you do need one quarterback of the team to bring together all the different risks that they've assessed and provide that guidance. The current, Brandon in his last job, CISA, made a recommendation to the White House for that. And the National Security Memorandum 22 that came out gave him kind of a lukewarm responsibility. I'd give him the full-on responsibility as a sector risk management leader for the federal government and making sure we work well in a public-private collaboration. So yes, we do need a CISA. We probably need a CISA that's envisioned differently than the last 2 presidential administrations have aligned it.
Sir, CISA is essential, both because it has unique sets of authorities and resources to tackle this problem. Only it has the authorities necessary to move the federal government in terms of protection of the .gov, in terms of providing both capabilities to agencies and helping departments and agencies across the government move to a more common baseline. I think we have seen with congressional support in terms of authorities and resources that since the SolarWinds attack in 2020, there has been a remarkable change in the degree of protection and security we have of our federal networks. I think as you look to the private sector, again, CISA's unique authorities in terms of engaging with industry to be able to have protected conversations, serve as a focal point, working with other sector risk management agencies. Those are unique authorities, capabilities, and expertise resident in CISA. And so that needs to continue. Now, how do we grow it? How do we refine it to make sure that we can tackle the scale and pace of the threat we face today is a challenge that we're all going to need to grapple with. But that all of it continues to point to the urgent need to continue those capabilities.
And I'm going to echo my colleagues here. CISA is absolutely essential to the defense of our critical infrastructure. This committee has done some powerful things for CISA, and I think it needs to continue. One is what I mentioned, CISA 2015, the superpower for information sharing, that liability protection that encourages the private sector to engage. Could be improved, but that is a key superpower. Another is that CISA is formed as a national coordinator for federal civilian executive branch agency defense of critical infrastructure. I think that needs to continue and in fact should be improved. There is language in the Homeland Security Act that allows CISA to provide technical assistance upon request to anybody that needs it, prioritized by critical infrastructure. That is key, but also strengthening CISA's ability to do that across borders, recognizing that our digital infrastructure is global in nature. CISA needs maybe some clarity on how to do that, provide that technical assistance when requested internationally as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I think it's clear that whatever CISAs end up being, that it appears that at least 3 of the 4, and maybe the 4th witness say, if it's CISA, I'll work with CISA, that we need to make sure that that mission that CISA presently undertakes is maintained, and with some of the enhancements offered, the coordination and other things, I think is very important. So with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I now recognize the former chairman of the committee and the the chairman emeritus, Mr. McCall from Texas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding your first hearing on this very important topic. And as the ranking member stated, a very bipartisan issue. The ranking member and I passed the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act in 2018 because it was a civilian agency we thought best capable to interact with the private sector. Since that time, I believe it's stood up its capabilities, its credibility, but the world is on fire today. It's a far more dangerous place than it was in 2018 from a cyber security perspective, particularly when you look at China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I was sanctioned by China. I'm the target of a disinformation campaign by China, along with 3 other members, one of whom now is the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. So I've kind of firsthand witnessed this. But I think one of the most frightening things to think about is this ability to pre-position malware on critical infrastructure to give them the capability to turn the switch off at any given time, and then to bring darkness to the entire East Coast or to ports, in New Orleans or Houston. Can you, maybe Admiral, start with you, explain how that exactly works, and what can we do to fortify and strengthen these critical infrastructures?
Thank you for the question.
I'm sorry, I was going to Admiral.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, thank you, sir. Look, you're right on. That to me, this was a prompt jump. In other words, what we discussed previously was intellectual property theft. There's been espionage. This operational preparation of the battlefield. It is a war-making action, and we have to take it much more seriously. I think that the idea that they've pre-positioned malware or that they have capabilities that lie in wait that can come out at the right time as we're making a decision to move, to respond to a crisis in Taiwan or a crisis in the Baltic states. Transcom operates on these unclassified networks with civilian systems. This is why I think former Representative Waltz is right in the sense that we have to go on the offensive. We now have to actually publicly execute operations against Chinese cyber infrastructure to say, we know you did this, we know you used this infrastructure to do this, and we're going to remove that infrastructure from your capability. Well, we may sacrifice a tool, we may sacrifice an access, but I think the military, Cyber Command and the intelligence communities have lots of tools and lots of accesses, but we need to demonstrate publicly, and we should attribute it to ourselves. Say, we did this because of what you did. Otherwise, the Chinese are going to keep doing what they're doing.
I totally agree. We need to call them out for this. We know that in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, they will shut down their entire grid and shut down all their cyber, and including probably hit the west coast of the United States at the same time.
How crazy would we go if we found 20 satchels of explosive strapped to different electrical power grids or port cranes around our country and could attribute it to China or Russia? Yeah. We would seriously be moving forces and say this is completely unacceptable behavior. But somehow in cyberspace they get a pass. That's not right. We need to be more offensive about this. The bar for taking action has got to be lowered down to one that makes America and our infrastructure secure. Right now, it's too high.
I think that physical analogy is always accurate. Like, for instance, when the OPM hack occurred, 23 million security clearances stolen. I mean, can you imagine if Chinese operatives were caught at OPM actually stealing that data in person? And we tend to think cyber somehow not, that it's different, and it's really not. Mr. Wales, can you, in my remaining time, this unholy alliance, I call it, between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, do you see any, in this alliance, any formation of working together in the cyber threat space?
So I'd say that there are some but limited connections at this point, in part because there is not a significant degree of trust amongst those countries, despite their willingness to work together in very isolated places. There have also been caught conducting operations against each other, which is one of the reasons why they don't have a tight of an alliance as, let's say, the United States does with its Five Eyes partners, where it's much closer sharing of information, conducting joint operations, et cetera. We don't see that yet amongst our adversaries, but that is changing. We're seeing closer connections in places like Ukraine in terms of Russia, Iran, North Korea, et cetera. So we obviously have to watch that space very carefully.
I passed the Cyber Diplomacy Act to help coordinate and deal with that on the defensive side, but I know my time has expired. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the ranking member of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Subcommittee, Mr. Swalwell, the gentleman from Palo Alto, California.
Bay Area.
Region, the Bay Area.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an important topic. It's a bipartisan topic. Andrew Garbarino and I work very closely together on the subcommittee. But as the senior Californian on the committee, and a committee that has jurisdiction over emergency management, I just briefly wanted to express my heart breaks and beats for the people in the Los Angeles area, where 28 have died, thousands of structures have been lost. Brave firefighters and first responders continue to battle the fires today as unseasonable and unpredictable winds ravage the area. And my ask of my colleagues is to just work with the representatives from that area, as we have worked with representatives from every area in America that's been affected by a disaster before. And we've seen in Tennessee, for example, since 2020, $39 billion from disasters. Since 2020, Texas has had $68 billion in disaster damage. Louisiana has had $34 billion from Hurricane Francine. Mississippi has had $30 billion. Florida, hit by Hurricane Milton and many other hurricanes, has had $30 billion. New York has had $31 billion in damages. Georgia has had $49 billion in damages. Alabama's had $32 billion in disaster damages. Oklahoma has had $30 billion in disaster damages. Arizona's had $9 billion in disaster damages. South Carolina has had $31 billion in disaster damage. Colorado has had $22 billion in disaster damage. Pennsylvania, $41 billion. And North Carolina, $37 billion. It's not a matter of if a disaster will hit your district or area if you are in Congress. It's just a matter of when. And the theme has always been that we come together. And I hope that's the case now. Last week, when I visited one of the affected areas, I stood with a mother at what was once the site where she and her husband raised their two little kids. And as she looked for any memento that she could take back to the kids, she saw that their lives and their home had been reduced to complete ash. She found a shiny metal piece in the ash and noticed that it was a little bowl that her daughter had played with in her make-believe kitchen, and that was all she walked away with to take back to her kids. And she didn't point fingers. She didn't put on a Republican jersey or a Democratic jersey. She just expects that the people who represent her will stand with her and help her find relief in the worst time of her life and the lives of her neighbors. And that's, I think, why we all do this job. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with the committee to make sure that wherever a disaster hits, we stand up for it. I'm going to briefly now just pivot to Admiral Montgomery, and I appreciate your service, sir, to the country. I have worked in a bipartisan way, and the chairman has supported this work to try and reform CISA, particularly as it relates to JCDC, the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, and to set more structure and scaffolding around how individuals are admitted into JCDC and how they could exit if they're not faithful partners to it. Do you see any needed reforms at JCDC?
Yes, sir, thank you, and I do. I appreciated the provision you put forward last Congress. I would only say, I would add to it, we need to move the JCDC beyond a Slack channel, which is what it is right now, a non-real-time information exchange. We need to get to real-time information exchange. When the Congress actually passed the provision that the JCDC operates off of, it was called the Joint Cyber Planning Office. We had I was running the Cyberspace Planning Commission when we put that forward. We had other elements to that were necessary. Those have not yet been passed. I think they need to be authorized because I think the JCDC, to be effective, needs to have a planning element, an information sharing element, which at the speed of data, so you can give threat information to private sector companies at the speed of data, and then a intel working group together that might be at a more classified level. That information sharing, though, has to be at the unclassified level. So I think the improvements in the JCDC through a provision would be an excellent assignment for the 119th Congress.
That's really helpful. I'll take that back to our team. Thank you, Admiral. Yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize former chair of the Border Subcommittee, Mr. Clay Higgins from the state of Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, ma'am, thank you for being here. Ms. Walden, in your testimony, your written testimony, you referenced the cybersecurity bill. You stated that the bill would help bring coherence to the multitude of federal regulatory approaches. The bill would have empowered the National Cyber Director to convene all of the relevant parties, including independent regulators, to develop a set of cross-sector minimum requirements that would have reciprocity baked in, whereby a business that operates in multiple sectors or that is in the supply chain of many regulated entities would only need to show they met the baseline once. You stated, I'm very confident this approach will both meaningfully improve our cybersecurity posture and reduce compliance costs. I hope Congress will continue last year's momentum and move swiftly to enact this legislation. I thank you for that statement, Ms. Walden, because that was my bill, introduced in the 118th Congress, the streamlining federal cybersecurity regulation. And we are indeed reintroducing that legislation in the 119th Congress. Mr. Chairman and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in this committee, we should move forward with that legislation because it allows the industry sector to appropriately position themselves to spend less time and money in compliance with regulatory oversight and more of their energy and focus on actually accomplishing their missions as it regards cybersecurity. Ms. Walden, could you briefly discuss more in depth how compliance with current cybersecurity regulations frameworks slows down the efforts to actually counter threats?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for reintroducing that bill. It's quite an important measure, I believe, for the overall building of resilience in our cybersecurity infrastructure, our digital infrastructure. Right now, across the 16 critical infrastructures, and I would add a few others that haven't been designated, some industries are highly regulated and also have wonderful controls. They could do better. But I'm thinking like finance, for example, and other industries are just under the mark, and those are the ones that are the most vulnerable. And so we need to figure out a regulatory approach to bring the minimum baseline up so that we're all solving the same problem and doing it in an efficient and an effective way. And so the proposition that your bill brings forward is not only do federal departments and agencies that have regulatory authority need to fall in line, but the independent agencies need to do so. And they need to find areas where there's duplicity, and so we can eliminate that, find areas for reciprocity, and then cause all of our infrastructure to have minimum security requirements so that we're not causing them to just spend money on.
Yes, ma'am. I agree. I mean, the federal government should be a partner with the cybersecurity industry and the emerging technologies, including AI. We should aggressively support the industry and their ability to actually perform the mission. So regulations and regulatory oversight should not get in the way of that mission. Mr. Myers, my own confidential cybersecurity consultants that have helped me through 8 years in congressional service to We the People happen to be partners with CrowdStrike, and they have shared with me their assessment that they have the best technology in their opinion out there, and your Overwatch team is outstanding. So I'd like to address to you, you've been in the business of tracking criminal and state-sponsored and nationalist cyber adversary groups across the globe, and you deploy technologies to detect suspicious and malicious cyber behavior and stop increasingly sophisticated adversaries. Your words. I would ask you to comment on the lack of ability for the security sector to strike back. Would you just address that topic, and I yield to the gentleman's answer.
Thank you, sir. The security industry, I think, is primarily meant for defensive posture, one that we take very seriously, and I appreciate your support there. I think that there's a lot to be done to partner with law enforcement and those that have the intelligence community as well and the military that have the titled authority to take those actions and to support those operations. And happy to share with you some of the previous successes in working through that. And as I mentioned in the testimony, I think it's time that we increase the cadence of those operations.
Thank you. My time has expired, but just yes or no. If you had the legal authority to strike back, if Congress gave the cybersecurity industry the legal authority to strike back, would you be able to effectively identify the bad actor and do so?
We have the visibility to identify many.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the indulgence.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner who also is a ranking member, and we appreciate his service for 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Chairman, and to the ranking member as well, and my colleagues. It's great to be back and to be starting out with such an important and bipartisan topic because the United States faces an incredibly dangerous and growing threat landscape with regard to cybersecurity. We face attacks from international cyber criminal groups, such as the Brain Cipher Group, which attacked my home state of Rhode Island last month, stealing sensitive information from hundreds of thousands of Rhode Islanders. And we also face increasingly brazen attacks from adversarial nations, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. We're all very familiar with the capabilities and increasing aggressiveness of China's cyber warfare campaign, most notably Salt Typhoon, which impacted the data of millions of Americans, and Volt Typhoon, which targets our critical infrastructure. And it's also important that we not lose sight of Russia's aggressiveness against our country as well. This past October, the Justice Department seized 41 internet domains being used by Russian hackers known as the Callisto Group, attempting to infiltrate U.S. companies and government agencies. And by the way, small-town America is not immune from this threat either. Last year, a separate Russian hacking group, the so-called Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, succeeded in disabling a water system in the town of Muleshoe, Texas, and a wastewater system in Tipton, Indiana, among others. So my first question, and I'll throw this out maybe to Admiral Montgomery or to any of you who have this information. If you had to guess, how many people, how many bodies is China, for example, putting into their cyber warfare campaign across all of the various organizations they have?
So this would be a guess, and I think if you go into a closed hearing, you might get a more refined answer, but I would say China is around 60,000.
60,000
To
people.
give you some comparison, the United States Cyber Mission Force, our offensive side, is about 6,400.
So China has 10 times as many people targeting us with cyber warfare as we have trying to defend ourselves. And I assume that Russia also, through their assorted organizations, thousands of individuals.
So, and first I should say, we have an intelligence community element number that we don't discuss, but it's not 54,000 to close the gap. Yeah. Russia has a different number, and Russia's they have both military and intelligence services that do actions, and they have contractors through what's called the IRA, a contracting group, and there's a mix of people in there who do both.
And then
but their number is much bigger.
Global criminal organizations, there are countless organizations and individuals targeting us with hacks, with ransomware, et cetera. During Governor Noem's confirmation hearing to be Homeland Security Secretary, she said that CISA needs to be, quote, much smaller to fulfill their mission. Do any of you agree that CISA should be smaller given the number of threat actors that are targeting the United States every day in the cyberspace? I will take that as a no. I'll also note, by the way, that she was one of only 2 governors who turned down federal grants for her state to strengthen cybersecurity as well. So there's a pattern here that is concerning that I'm sure we will ask her about when she comes before this committee, assuming she is confirmed. I also want to commend, well, a number of the recommendations that have been made I think are terrific and make great sense. I want to commend you again, Admiral, for targeting the issue of critical infrastructure. I'm the co-sponsor of a bill with Congressman Crenshaw called the Contingency Plans for Critical Infrastructure Act to mandate that we identify and have contingency plans for critical infrastructure in the event of a cyber attack. Also the role of the National Guard. I want to give a shout out to the 102nd Cyber Operations Squadron at the Rhode Island National Guard, who do a phenomenal job. And I actually agree with, I think, a sentiment that the chairman raised and a number of you as well, which is that we need to call cyber attacks what they are. They are attacks, whether they're targeting our data or our critical infrastructure. And I would just suggest that when foreign actors put misinformation into our information sphere as well with the purpose of trying to influence elections or turn Americans against each other by racial lines or religious lines or political lines, that is an attack as well. And we need to call that out for what it is. Americans have a First Amendment right to say whatever we want online, whether it's true or divisive or not, and that is a constitutionally protected right. But Iran, Russia, China, etc., do not have that First Amendment right. When they attempt to influence our domestic condition by turning Americans against each other, undermining election integrity, undermining confidence, that is an attack, and we need to call that out as well. So I'm over time. I thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the Chairman of Transportation Subcommittee, Mr. Jimenez from Florida, for 5 minutes questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I move on to cybersecurity, as the only career firefighter ever elected to Congress, I want to share, my colleague, Mr. Swalwell's condolences to what happened in LA. But I also would like to see if you would consider doing some kind of a fact-finding trip by this committee to LA to determine what the conditions were prior to the fire, what the response to that fire was, and also what strategies, what mitigation strategies that we need to take in order to make sure it never happens again. Because there are certain things there that that caused me a little bit of concern about that whole situation. Mostly was really about the fuel and the control of the fuel, because fire needs three things. It needs an ignition source, it needs oxygen, and it needs fuel. And the ignition source, we haven't determined that yet, but when you have hurricane force winds, you certainly have enough oxygen. It appears that they had a heck of a lot of fuel, and they didn't do a very good job of
Gentleman, yield for a question.
maintaining that. Yeah, I will.
Just since Mr. Swalwell isn't here, I anticipate what he would ask is, would you also be interested in a fact-finding trip or study to see if, for example, the state of Florida has taken adequate steps to reduce flooding in the event of a hurricane or to reduce damage?
Oh, absolutely.
Natural
I
disasters?
think we are fantastic at what we do in the state of Florida, and
I just want to make sure we're putting the same
no,
scrutiny
absolutely,
on every
yeah,
state, not just.
And we learn
one
every
state.
after every hurricane. I wouldn't have any problem in doing that. You want to visit me when I was the mayor? Sure, come on. Be happy to show you what we've done. Okay. Now back to artificial intelligence. To actually cybersecurity. Does artificial intelligence have applications in cybersecurity and a defense mechanism? And so, Mr. Myers or Mr. Wales, if you want to answer that question.
Yes, and I actually would say that right now we're at a unique moment where artificial intelligence is being integrated into cybersecurity applications far faster than we're seeing adversaries able to weaponize artificial intelligence to launch attacks. So most companies, SentinelOne, and among others, are working hard to make sure that their technology benefits from the latest and most modern artificial intelligence applications.
So Mr. Myers, do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. We've been using machine learning and artificial intelligence for the last 14 years at CrowdStrike.
Fantastic. What do you all think about yesterday's announcement of a $500 billion investment in artificial intelligence, the Stargate initiative, I guess? Anyone can answer that if they want. Do you know about that?
I read in the news. What I would say is it is important, particularly in competition vis-a-vis China, that the United States be a real leader here. So anything that we are doing as a nation to ensure that artificial intelligence innovation is happening inside the United States is going to be good for both our security and our economic well-being.
Mr. Rear Admiral, if we win that race, would that be able to supplant the manpower advantage that our adversaries may have in that regard in terms of cyber attacks and our ability to defend them?
I do believe artificial intelligence and machine learning can make a big difference in the speed with which you find accesses and develop tools. One thing I would give Congress is as we see that $500 billion get invested, the one area, I'm not for regulatory environment here, but the one thing I would regulate, much like we do at our national labs, is I would demand a level of physical and cybersecurity around that most important intellectual property, the model weights and things like that. Again, I wouldn't heavily regulate the entrepreneurial spirit, but I would regulate the security so that we maintain any breakthroughs belong to us and belong to the United States companies and eventually to the United States military and aren't easily stolen by our adversaries.
No, I believe that the artificial intelligence technology is a national security technology, much as any weapon system that we have, maybe even more important than any weapon system that we have. We have to maintain that advantage and keep it in a very, very, very secure place. And hopefully the artificial intelligence will be able to guard itself, okay? Finally, do we have any rebound capability? In other words, what I mean by rebound capability, somebody attacks you and then the response, the rebound to that is even worse than the attack, so that you know that if you punch me in the nose, I'll cut your head off. Do we have that capability?
Sir, that's what I was talking about with deterrence. You know, where we've talked a lot about deterrence by denial here. That deterrence by cost imposition is the punch back. And then defensively, we do have to have a rapid recovery. One of the things America's good at is getting back up off the mat, you know, when we're hit. But in cyberspace, I don't think we're properly organized for that yet. And this is more than FEMA. This has got to be, we call it continuity of the economy planning, and we've got to get working on that. So a better offense and a better ability to recover once we're punched in the face. Those are going to be the two things we need to win.
I know my time's up, and just simple yes or no. Will artificial intelligence help us in that? Yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Goldman, the gentleman from New York, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree. I'm encouraged by the bipartisan nature of this hearing on what is increasingly an important and dangerous threat to our homeland and our security. In the past, though, it has not been as bipartisan. And in fact, in September of 2023, more than 100 House Republicans, including the chairman, tried to slash CISA's budget by $3 billion, which was 25% of the budget. Now, this is because many Republicans did not like the fact that CISA, the CISA head at the time, said that the 2020 election was not stolen, and, quote, there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. That CISA director was Chris Krebs, who was then immediately fired by Donald Trump, and Mr. Wales, you took over. Mr. Wales, do you agree with Mr. Krebs' statement that there is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised, and that the 2020 election was free and fair?
Yes.
So part of the problem here is that even though CISA's misinformation and disinformation activities represent less than 0.1% of its budget, Republicans have tried to cut 25% of the budget, and Governor Noem has made it clear in her hearing that she would like to limit and reduce the size of and role of CISA, which seems odd in this time when all we are hearing from our witnesses here is the increasing danger of cyber attacks and cyber infiltration exacerbated by artificial intelligence. We know Russia used cyber warfare to interfere in our 2016 election. We know China has tried to do the same, but it's not a partisan issue because Iran tried to do the same thing by infiltrating Donald Trump's campaign. And it is bewildering to me that given the CrowdStrike disaster with the outage, which dramatically affected my district, with the Microsoft hacking that gave China access to senior government officials' information, that we would be reducing the budget to address our cybersecurity. One thing I want to address, Mr. Wales, I'll ask you first, is what would the impact of reducing CISA's budget or reducing the size of CISA be, both in terms of our broader cybersecurity and infrastructure security, as the Rear Admiral has talked about, as well as election integrity and preventing foreign influence in our elections?
A lot would depend upon how that cut was allocated, but broadly, it would dramatically limit the ability of the agency to conduct critical missions. So that would include its ability to provide technical support to critical infrastructure and state and local governments who request assistance with actual cyber incidents or conducting pre-incident assessments of their vulnerabilities so they can be hardened. It would compromise its ability to perform its functions across the federal networks in terms of both monitoring and responding to incidents, deploying technology to ensure that federal networks are protected by best-in-breed technology platforms. But just across the board, it would lessen its ability to respond at a time of significant cyber threats as been described today.
And in terms of the election integrity work that CISA does, is it accurate that that is primarily focused on foreign actors and foreign interference?
Almost all of CISA's work when it comes to elections is actually focused on cyber and physical security related work, providing assistance to state and local governments who need assistance, who request vulnerability assessments, scanning for vulnerabilities, conducting training, doing physical security assessments, increasingly as state and local election officials are concerned about physical security threats that they may face. That is almost the entirety of the election security work. So any cuts to the CISA budget would affect its ability to support those officials.
And CISA is the only the only department within any executive branch agency that provides that cybersecurity service to state and local officials who administer our elections. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you, and I thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlemen yields. I now recognize the chairman of our counterterrorism subcommittee, Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate this hearing. I'll get right into it. When you look back at Storm 0558, Salt Typhoon, I mean, the list goes on and on. I'm obviously worried about critical infrastructure, not just in my own district that includes energy production, but every other aspect of our lives. So I'll start with you, Mr. Wales. In last Congress, I introduced the 7 Act, which was, and I hope that we can mark it up in this committee this year and send it to the floor because it's a coordinating piece of legislation that asks our federal agencies to do the hard work of coordinating. So who is the lead government agency when it comes to responding immediately to a cyber threat?
So different agencies are going to bring different authorities to the table, and you're going to want all those authorities to deal with the challenges that we have. So CISA has certain authorities in being able to help an entity recover from an incident, making sure they understand what's happened, but you also want, at the same time, the FBI that can use its law enforcement authorities to figure out who the adversary is and are the things that can be done to disrupt their infrastructure, impose consequences. There's coordination with the intelligence community that's going to be tracking adversaries overseas. So there's not necessarily going to be one person because no one agency has all the authorities, resources, and capabilities that we're going to need to tackle that problem. And what you want are those agencies working closely together. And I would argue from my time in and having just left, the operational coordination amongst the agencies working on cybersecurity is better now than it has ever been.
Ms. Walden, how would you grade the response to, let's just say, Salt Typhoon to the cyber attack? And I'm going to pull this thread just a little bit, that there's no single agency that's in charge. There's a lot of stakeholders, but how was our response to Salt Typhoon?
Well, sir, I think the response to Salt Typhoon was adequate and appropriate. I was not in government as part of the apparatus at the time that Salt Typhoon was discovered, but I do think it was adequate and appropriate.
Admiral Montgomery, good to see you. Let's go on that. How was our response? What could be better? And do we need a lead agency to help coordinate?
So hearing those answers, as a 35 years in the military, I kind of learned you need one leader. One agency needs to be in charge. I've never seen a military organization work with 2 leaders in charge. So the right answer is CISA. I think we have to create that condition. Look, do I think other people contribute to it? The Sector Risk Management Agency that's responsible for that industry, sure. But in the end, there can be only one. And that leader, I think, needs to be CISA. I think the Biden administration missed a great opportunity to do that. in National Security Memorandum 22, even though CISA was telling them to do it and asking for that lead responsibility, they did not get it. I think we need to, as we redo national security memorandums and things, I think an upgrade to that, to put CISA in charge. This is a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
You know, this committee created CISA. You need CISA to be that leader on the Hill.
You know, in the aftermath of the Loper-Bright decision, the Chevron deference precedent, Mr. Chairman, I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to be specific in this committee and to take what Admiral Montgomery is saying and designate a lead agency and actually tell the agencies what we want them to do, not just give them the open blank chalkboard to write what they think is best, but for Congress to take an oversight role. In your written testimony, Admiral Montgomery, you used the term lying in wait when you were referring to the Volt Typhoon attack. Who is lying in wait now, and what is the next attack that keeps you up at night? And then, Mr. Myers, I want you to comment on the same thing.
I think all of the axis of authoritarians could lie in wait. That's China, Russia, India, North Korea. But I think realistically, the countries that are thinking about that they need to stop an American ability to mobilize forces or really weaken our economic productivity, it's China and Russia. I think China is the predominant actor right now. I think Russia is distracted by other things. I have no doubt that there's Russian malware in our systems with access, with an ability to be accessed at a later date. So it's China, Russia, and we got to keep our eye on, if I had to choose one, I'd choose China.
Thank you. Mr. Myers, I'll give you the last 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir. These incidents are not over. Salt Typhoon is an ongoing activity by an adversary, as is Volt Typhoon, or what we call Vanguard Panda. So this is something that we need to continuously engage. We need to continuously identify it, root them out, and put a stop to them and cut off their access. So I would say that I just want to make that point that this is something that's ongoing. We need to remain focused on it.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Ramirez for her 5 minutes of testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Green. Thank you, and thank you, Ranking Member. Truly grateful to be back in my second term serving in this committee that I believe will need the leadership of all of us, and certainly those of us who have personal experiences with a lot of the work that we do here. So I want to talk to you, Mr. Wales, a little here. You served as CISA's executive director from 2020 until August of last year. And in that capacity, you oversaw the execution of the agency's operations. So you're well aware of how CISA was investing its resources, correct?
Yes.
So Governor Noem, Trump's pick to lead DHS, has stated that CISA was far off mission from its work to combat mis and disinformation, and that, in quotes, they were using their resources in ways that were never intended. Mr. Wales, I want the record to be clear about how CISA spends its resources. To the best of your recollection, Mr. Wales, how much of CISA's budget is spent on mis and disinformation work?
At the last time we looked at this, it was something less than $2 million.
So what would that be percent over the entire budget?
Far less than 1% of a $3 billion budget.
So less than 1% of the total budget. And has CISA mis or disinformation work ever interfered with its ability to execute cybersecurity mission?
I don't believe so.
Thank you. As part of the bipartisan infrastructure law passed in 2021, Congress provided $1 billion in new grants to state and local governments to enhance their cybersecurity. State and local governments have struggled, we know, to adequately defend their networks, exposing them frequently to cyber attacks and putting critical public infrastructure at risk. As funding for this program flows to state and local governments, we're also seeing the important progress it's having and addressing in longstanding underinvestment in state and local cyber defense. Unfortunately, this program expires in September. At the same time, we continue to see a rise in global cyber threats. So this is a question I have to all witnesses in the time that I have left. Do you agree, yes or no, that the state and local cybersecurity grant program should be reauthorized? Sir? Yes? Is that? I can't see the names here, so I'm, yes. All right.
Yes.
Thank you. And let me ask you a follow-up question, and this one would get a sentence or two from each of you. And we're going to be fair here, so we want to make sure everyone gets a little time. What are the national security implications if we fail to adequately defend state and local government networks? I'll start with you.
Thank you. Threat actors target state and local governments very frequently, and they understand that those are accesses that can lead to strategic or tactical objectives that will secure their goals. And so I think that we need to make sure that we ensure that those state and local entities and to include school districts are well protected from a cyber perspective.
Thank you. Mr. Montgomery?
Sure. So state and local governments are the low-hanging fruit. They usually don't have two wood nickels to rub together to increase their, to spend on their utilities, because we as voters don't like to let them increase their rates. But I will tell you, the number one thing they need is workforce. The best way to get it, that's the Pivot Act. So if you bring that back this cycle, I think you're going to attack the number one issue state and local governments have.
Mr. Wales?
I would just say that state and local government agencies are the closest to the American citizens. So disruptions at the state and local level are ones that people feel quickly in their schools, in their utilities that are provided, in the public services that they often get. And so absolutely, this is an area where adversaries target, particularly ransomware groups, but as well as nation states. So it is an area that needs attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wales. And Ms. Walden?
I agree with all of my colleagues. I want to point out, in addition to everything that they've said, is that state and local entities really need to work on their technical debt, figuring out how to resolve some of their legacy technology so that they are able to withstand cyber attacks that are happening in their backyards every day.
Thank you, Ms. Walden. It's clear that reauthorizing is going to be critical for this moment. Thank you so much. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize our chairman of the Cyber Security Subcommittee, Mr. Garbarino, the gentleman from New York, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. I love how you had him place the Pivot Act in his last answer and say how he had to pass it again. That was well placed there. Thank you all to the witnesses for all being here. It's great to see you all again. This hearing is very important, and I think your focus on China has been, it's obvious that they are our number one adversary, and if we can combat and defend against China, we can probably defend against everybody else, because they're the best at what they do. We have to be better. I want to talk about what CISA should be doing, and are they doing what they should be doing? What else? What other authorities should we give them? Mr. Wales, you were there for a very long time. You were executive director and acting director. What should CISA be doing that it's not doing, and should we give them any more authorities that they don't currently have to step up their game and defend against China?
Yeah, so I would say that, looking at CISA's two primary missions in cyber, one is to help protect the federal government's networks, and two, to help support the security and resilience of our critical infrastructure networks. In the federal government space, thanks to a lot of resources and authorities from the government, I think CISA needs to continue the momentum. We are in a much different place than we were in 2020 during SolarWinds. The federal government is far more secure today. It's the reason why federal government agencies identified compromises of places like Microsoft, because of the investments that Congress has made in both CISA and across the federal government. I think there it's about building momentum and keeping that going. When it comes to critical infrastructure, it's a much more challenging problem. It's a much more crowded space. CISA's real role is to be that focal point, to coordinate amongst all of the other agencies that are working in this space. I do think CISA has sufficient authorities, but it's really an issue of scale. Can we meet the scale of the challenge with both technical assistance, training? Do we have the right tools to bring to bear to meet this challenge? And I do think that there are areas that need work, and I'm hoping that the Trump administration will focus on how do we improve the operational collaboration, build on the framework that exists today with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, but take it to the next level, continue to drive improvements in our ability to work side by side with industry on day-to-day operational cyber threats. And I think that is where the most urgent need is.
You talk about defending against the federal networks. The executive order that was signed, I think, last week tried to do that with threat hunting. A lot of agencies don't like CISA participating on their networks. Does the executive order go far enough, or is it something we have to act legislatively to tell and everybody can jump in here, to tell these agencies, hey, you have to let CISA do its job and threat hunt here?
This builds on authorities that Congress gave to CISA in the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act that gave them the ability to threat hunt on federal agencies without permission. That was important. Then supplemental funding allowed the deployment of endpoint detection and response technology that gave the security sensors the ability to actually hunt on. This executive order requires agencies to actually provide that sensor information to CISA that allows them to conduct that threat hunting. It is absolutely essential. That is the way that you spot adversary campaigns early. It is the way you look consistently across agencies, so you're not dependent upon the differences in capabilities at various agencies, the amount of staff, et cetera. So I do think that part of the executive order is strong. I don't necessarily know that they need additional legislative authority, but it is something that is going to be important for the next administration to continue to push agencies to ensure that CISA has the level of visibility it needs to conducting the threat hunting that gives you the cybersecurity outcomes that you want.
Thank you. Ms. Walden, did you want to add something? It looked like you were getting ready to. And if you don't, that's fine. I have other questions. Okay. And you talked also, Mr. Wells, about information sharing, I think is what you were getting at, between private and public sector when it comes to critical infrastructure, because 80% or 85% of critical infrastructure is controlled by private sector. Do we have that type of information sharing now? I don't think we do, and I think sometimes it happens as well, and sometimes it doesn't happen very well.
This is I've been talking about information sharing since I joined the department in 2005, first starting on counterterrorism, not in cyber. There is always ways that we can improve information sharing. It has improved dramatically over the past 8 years, but there is a long way to go. And it's also a question of, do you have the right private sector in the room? Are you sharing information at a speed at which it can be effective in the cybersecurity context? And are people capable of using that information to improve their security in real time? And I think there is a lot of work to do to make sure that that happens.
Going both ways. And I'm out of time, but I did just want to say before I end, Rear Admiral, your comments on continuation of the economy in your written statement is 100%, I think, on point. We directed the Biden administration to come up with a plan. They failed. And I think this is a huge thing that we need to work on with the Trump administration. We have to come up with a real continuation of the economy plan, just like Congress bipartisanly directed the administration to do. So with that, I yield back, Chairman.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Poe for 5 minutes of questioning. And welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Green and Ranking Member Thompson, for holding today's hearing. I am proud to be among the newest members of the Committee on Homeland Security. My North Jersey district is just across the river from New York City. So many constituents remember well the horrific, unprecedented terrorist attack that occurred there 2 decades ago. I take my appointment to this committee very seriously, and I am excited to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisles and collaborate with stakeholders and experts to advance solutions to improve the safety and security of New Jersey and our nation. The Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015 is set to expire this year. Since its enactment 10 years ago, this law has created critical information sharing partnerships and collaboration between the government and the private sector. These relationships have enabled America to better respond to rapidly evolving cyber threats, making the country safer. To each of our 4 witnesses, can you please describe the benefit of the Cyber Information Sharing Act, but please detail, if you would, how would a lapse in this authority affect our nation's security? Mr. Myers, or Ms. Walden? Okay.
I can start. So the importance of the Cybersecurity Information Security Act, unfortunately the same name, acronym CISA 2015, is paramount, because what it does is it gives liability protections to industry to share with DHS and through CISA, to share amongst each other in order to be able to, at least at a minimum, get rid of the low-hanging fruit. They are allowed to share cyber threat indicators and defensive measures for a cybersecurity purpose. They are protected from FOIA. They're protected from antitrust litigation. They're protected from sunshine laws, and et cetera, and et cetera. This is key. This is a key underpinning law that enables the JCDC, for example, that enables other vulnerability assessments that take place, that enables us to be able, the government, to be able to interface with industry at the speed of data.
Thank you.
I would just add that most importantly, it provides assurance to the industry that they will be protected. Some people may be willing to share without this law, but the reality is many won't because they don't have 100% certainty that they're not going to suffer any consequences, whether through some type of litigation or suit. And so ensuring that it is reauthorized is critical for enabling cyber information sharing to happen between the private sector and the federal government as a whole.
I would support its reauthorization. I'd also remind that back 9 years ago, it was weakened significantly in the Senate before it was passed. I think you should take a look at strengthening the liability protections for the companies in that legislation. And at the same time, I would take advantage of the opportunity to integrate CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, into it, strengthen its ability. As I said earlier, we have to get off a Slack channel. We have to get into we have to have authorized a system for actual speed of data transmission. And we've got to push the intelligence communities to figure out how to get that down to the unclassified level so that there's a benefit and burden to this, to the private sector. They both benefit from much better intelligence from the government, and the burden is they've got to report, they've got to report what they're seeing and work closely with the government to pass on their information.
Thank you. Very quickly, Mr. Myers.
Thank you. Information sharing is critical for our success. It's us, it's the vendors, it's our customers, it is our partners in the government versus the adversaries. It's versus China, Iran, North Korea. And so information sharing is really the essential building block of how we secure our infrastructure.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. Green, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into some questions, I'd just like to point out that, Mr. Wales, in your testimony, you talked about Iran's cyber hacking attempts against President Trump's campaign this past election cycle, aimed at undermining President Trump's candidacy and sowing discord within the United States electoral process. So thank you for pointing that out. While cyber threats from our foreign adversaries must absolutely be protected against, we also can't forget that our own independent cybersecurity agency, CISA, was more focused on conducting its own large-scale election interference campaign through its censorship laundering complex against our own people, rather than bolstering our cybersecurity efforts and working to protect our critical infrastructure. Just some brief stats. The average cost of a data breach in the U.S. amounts to $9.36 million, almost double that of the global average. As you, Mr. Montgomery, testified, the FBI received reports of $12.5 billion in cybercrime losses in the United States in 2023, an increase of nearly 20% over 2022, which is definitely alarming. Ransomware attacks rose 74% from 2022 to 2023. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure globally increased 30% in 2023. 1 in 3 Americans, and this is shocking, were affected by healthcare data breaches last year. Government agencies were the third most targeted sector from ransomware attacks in 2023, and there are roughly 500,000 vacant cybersecurity jobs in the United States, Mr. Chairman. That is a serious issue. Most cyber attacks fall into a never-ending pattern. A threat actor, often sponsored by a nation-state, exploits vulnerabilities in the system. They exfiltrate sensitive data or encrypt it for ransom. Then there is an investigation into how it happened, who was involved, and what measures should be taken to prevent it from happening again. And then it happens again and the cycle repeats, and we're all in a very serious dilemma. Mr. Montgomery, in your testimony, you talk about some specific offensive and defensive solutions that we can take to address the needs of our cybersecurity shortfalls. Could you elaborate a little more on that, please?
Sure, thank you. I would highlight in that first, we absolutely have to invest in our sector risk management agencies to make sure they're doing their job. It's shocking sometimes when you look at a Department of Energy spends what I think is probably the right amount, somewhere between $50 and $100 million a year on being a sectorist managed agency, helping energy companies protect themselves. Then you go to the Department of Agriculture and they're spending $500,000, or Department of Education, they're spending $250,000. Most of us understand that's 2 full-time equivalents or 1 full-time, it's 1 human or 2 humans. And that's just website management. You're not helping the 8,000 farms and food distribution networks out there with 1 person manning a website. And you're not helping our K through 9,000 districts out there with 1 person manning a website. We need more consistent focus, leadership from the top down, cabinet members down, on cybersecurity as a responsibility they have as a cabinet member. And then when appropriate, the funding to do that kind of thing. So to me, that's the number one. And I spoke earlier about military mobility. If I could only focus on 3 things, it would be rail, aviation, and ports. Because if we don't get that right, China, Russia, doesn't matter. If they initiate combat operations that we're going to be involved in, we won't get there fast enough.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Montgomery. I completely agree with you. Those are very critical infrastructure things that we have to protect. With AI being the biggest emerging industry in the technology industry, I'd like to ask each of you, how can we protect Americans, protect our government, protect ourselves from cyber attacks, and how do you see AI playing a role in that, maybe for the good or for the bad?
I'll start. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Myers.
Artificial intelligence can be one of the solutions to a lot of the problems that you highlighted. When we think about the cyber workforce, artificial intelligence can take more junior analysts and make them more senior analysts by automating and helping them deal with complex problems at scale and at speed. I'll also say that artificial intelligence in the security domain can be used to identify and quickly remediate these attacks. So there is a huge opportunity there. The one caution I'll say is that I think in the next 1 to 3 years, we'll be seeing more and more organizations and businesses employing their own artificial intelligence. And that will create a situation where there's what we would call AI workloads that need to be protected. So we need to be thinking about how can we proactively start talking about protecting those AI workloads today before they become a problem in the future.
That makes sense. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, can we allow our witnesses to each answer?
Very quickly, a yes, no, but that we need to move on. So if you've got a quick yes, no, you can do a quick yes, no.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming to the committee today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. And I now recognize Mr. Turner from Texas. Also, welcome to the committee, sir, for your 5 minutes question.
Thank you, Chairman Green and Ranking Member Thompson. It's good to be with everyone. What I've noticed is that there are same running themes from each and every one of you. Let me just say that it's Mayor City of Houston. We face thousands of cyber threats every year. And cyber workforce, critical. The grants to state and local government, critical. And cities and states under constant attack. A coordinated approach, collaboration, all important. And that's why I'm a strong supporter of CISA. In fact, when it came into existence, we went thumbs up. Aviation, the port, utilities, our water systems are under constant threat. And as a mayor, that is something that kept me up every night. When we saw what happened in Atlanta, when the ransomware gangs took over, municipal police costing the city a great deal, we all tried to intensify our efforts, built layers and layers, but we simply didn't have enough money to do enough. So let me applaud each and every one of you, because each one of you said, I think Mr. Myers, the threat has increased 200, 300%. I think Admiral, you indicated a persistent vulnerability that exists. Each one of you, the same themes over and over again. Let me just go directly to the Office of National Cybersecurity Director. Ms. Walden, during your time at ONCD, both as the Principal Deputy National Cyber Director and as acting National Cyber Director, you were part of the development of this new office. How has the creation of ONCD strengthened our national cybersecurity, and what additional steps should the new administration take for a coordinated approach to cybersecurity across the federal government?
Thank you. So the National Cyber Director's Office was created to provide strategic cybersecurity advice to the President so that, just as Admiral Montgomery said, we have some accountability and some responsibility from the very top all the way down. And that should be true in the federal government as well. And there were a couple of things that we sought to achieve. The first is to make sure that we have a more defensible, more resilient digital ecosystem. And that includes state and local entities. That means that we needed to do two things. One, shift cybersecurity risks so that it is not solely the burden of cities and counties and educators, and shift that so that it's more the burden of the federal government, of large enterprises, of producers, et cetera. And then, with that residual risk, once we buy it down, to build in resilience, not just in the technology, but the technology is important. The backbone of the internet, Salt Typhoon showed us, is important, but in the workforce, and the people, and the ability to be able to maintain all the new technology. And doctrinally, who's in charge of what, when, and how. So that the work that we did there came with it, that strategic work came with it a full action plan. And that full action plan allowed each department and agency to take on responsibility for a particular provision of that strategy that allowed state and local governments to plug in, that allowed companies to plug in and to move the needle forward. That was the strength of the National Cyber Director's Office. And I'll point out, the National Cyber Director was able to, with the Office of Management and Budget, prioritize for federal departments and agencies how to ask for federal funding in order to be able to pursue that mission. That kind of central activity within the White House was important in the last administration, and I see it going forward.
Thank you. And Mr. Montgomery, in your role with the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, you advocated for the creation of ONCD. What success have you seen from this new office, and how important is it that the new administration empower ONCD going forward?
Well, look, I think Kemba did a great job as acting National Cyber Director, and I think as did Chris Inglis and Harry Coker as National Cyber Directors. So I think the most important things are the budget control. In the end, we all know resources are what drive things. So maintaining that budget control. What I wish they could do is expand it to make sure that the sector risk management agency functions are being paid for. The second thing I think they're really good at is the workforce. Protecting those. So again, they'll be critical when we do get the Pivot Act passed. And the third thing I think they're most important for is getting this harmonization of regulation. We've got to reduce the regulation on our industries. And so I think if they're able to do all three of those things, the next administration's National Cyber Director will be successful.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell from Texas for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral, I've got a small nursing home that's located in one of my little small towns in my district, and they had a cyber attack. And we called in CISA. We started going through checking the boxes, and the FBI came in. And what ended up happening is when the FBI came on board and CISA were working in parallel with each other, it turned into a proverbial fist fight. Who was in charge? And as this thing kind of inched along, the result was that the nursing home didn't get any results. And you mentioned earlier, if you follow the chain of command, there inevitably has to be one leader, one person in charge. And the net has been cast out very wide, given just kind of the proverbial threat when it comes to cyber risk, cyber threat, cyber attacks. Can you give me some refinement on the best course of action on how to decrease that problem set?
First, thanks for bringing that up. And I think you highlight that rural healthcare right now and small healthcare facilities are probably the greatest risk we have in the utility area. And the reason I say that is that if they get a ransomware attack, most of them have about 5 or 6 weeks of float. That is, if they don't end the ransomware attack and fully recover their systems within 4, 5, 6 weeks, they could be out of business, and then the community loses its health care. So the first thing I'll tell you is HHS, Health and Human Services, has to do a much better job supporting these guys left of boom. And one of the things we're pushing hard there is like a fractional CISO program. What that means is, I guarantee that hospital that you're talking about or clinic could not afford a full-time CISO to prevent this ransomware and recover from it.
Correct.
What we need to do is have a program where they can access a pot of CISOs who come in, who've done ransomware hundreds of times, help that hospital get back on its feet and recover, not just pay the ransomware, that's the easy part. It's restructuring the systems. But you need specific CISOs to do that, but you could only afford about 10 days of that CISO, not 365 days of his or her $400,000 salary. So to do this, we need a virtual fractional CISO program for rural healthcare. So that's the first thing I do. That stuff you'd plan left of boom. Once the right, and you're asking me about the cluster that was right of boom.
Yes, sir.
That cluster right of boom has got that starts with the White House. That starts with the National Security Memorandum that clearly states who's responsible and who's in charge. Now, a very localized one like that, it can be done by, there'll be some who have a better regional footprint, but a larger one, it's clearly to me, it's CISA. But you have to have a rule set for it, just like you and I had rule sets operating in the Navy. And with that kind of like structured command, I think we're going to continue to have failures like you saw. But I would say there's things we can do left of boom to prevent these from being the small business killing events that they are.
Yeah, because that facility was networked. So not only did it touch them all, it took them to a knee. And thank you for that. Ms. Walden, I thought your opening statement was amazing, very point-driven, and I appreciate that. You were digital crimes unit, you oversaw digital crimes unit. Can you give me some background and finding information on exactly what that entailed? Because where I'm going with this is, we talk about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but make no mistake about it, there's some proverbial bad actors in the continental United States as well. And in my district, and I represent a small portion of Harris County, and sex trafficking is actually in Houston, sex trafficking is the #1 city in the country. Can you kind of talk me through, because what I would like to do is, we're in 2025. There's just no way in hell we're going to go back to analog. I mean, the digital revolution is here. We're not going to get away from it. And it's as great as it is, it's terrifying in a sense. Can you give me a course of action moving forward that this committee and this administration can jump on top of to decrease that problem set?
Sure. First, I want to correct something for the record. You've given me a promotion. I was not in charge of the digital crimes unit, but I was.
Yeah, you're welcome. Happy birthday.
And I was responsible specifically for going after the ransomware threat.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Platform, which was an incredible mission set. If you can imagine the large enterprises like Microsoft or like Google, like
yes, ma'am.
et cetera, see millions of signals a day. And they have within their data set a lot of information that allows us to see when there's a threat actor. CrowdStrike can do the same thing. And we can go after them using legal means, which is what I was in charge for, but also technical means, cleaning up our own networks, because cybersecurity risk was borne by the larger enterprises, should be, and they need to buy them down for all of its customers. So what I would suggest is that we employ policy solutions, or this committee can employ policy solutions to shift that cybersecurity risk burden to those that are more capable of buying them down. That means Microsofts of the world should be coordinating with CISA and sharing information back and forth. Microsofts of the world should be able to identify when there are threat actors to immediately deliver that information. And I don't mean to just pick on
Yes,
them,
ma'am. I got it.
but you know what I mean.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the new ranking member of, I think, Transportation, right? Ms. McIver. Congratulations, and you're recognized for 5 minutes for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and to our witnesses for joining us today. Cybersecurity is no longer just a technical issue. It is a critical national security challenge that touches every part of our daily lives. I represent New Jersey's 10th Congressional District, and I see firsthand the importance of protecting our communities, whether it's safeguarding sensitive information for small businesses, securing local hospitals, or ensuring that critical infrastructure like power grids and transportation systems remain resilient against cyber attacks. With that being said, in my district, which is home to critical infrastructure such as ports, transportation hubs, and energy facilities that are vital not only to our state, but also to our entire nation. Can you elaborate on what Congress can do to better protect and work with local governments and private sector stakeholders in districts like mine to secure these critical assets from cyber threats? That's to anyone who would like to answer.
I can start. I would recommend that Congress continue to explore state and local grant-giving opportunities to be able to reduce some of the legacy technical debt that exists across critical infrastructure. I would also encourage that you explore opportunities to expand internships, externships to qualifying students and SFS programs, for example, or CyberCorps, to be able to deliver to state and locals the talent that they need in order to be maintain systems, to vend systems, and respond to incidents.
Thank you.
Ma'am, could I add on to that two things? One, we need bottom-up support. And what I mean by that is there are places where the federal agencies are just too small or too under-resourced to regulate. We've noticed this in water, the 55,000 water agencies. So we've been pushing for something called a Water Risk and Resilience Organization. Representative Crawford introduced it in the last legislation. What that does is allow trade associations to work with federal agencies in order to establish the right level of standards. If I could give one more, ma'am, it's clinics. We've seen this at, for example, Google sponsors them, but in addition, other areas of spending. And what that does is allow local community colleges and vocational schools to run programs where their cybersecurity future professionals can work with the local governments and authority and utilities to improve cybersecurity.
Thank you.
If I may also, as we just heard about the clinic or the nursing facility in Texas, and similar to the small businesses and the critical parts of the transportation infrastructure that you just mentioned, there is two issues that I think we can address. One is that there is a lack of cyber workforce, which we've also heard about earlier today. Some of this can be countered by relying on technology like artificial intelligence, but we can also work to bring more interns and bringing more STEM into the lower levels of schools, down to the junior high school level, even to start to train the next wave of workforce. And also, as mentioned in my recommendations, I think there is things we can do to incentivize these businesses to invest in the right cybersecurity by incentivizing them to use managed security services that can help protect them left of boom. As we've heard, there's a lot of work that can be done today that will have payoff in dividends.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. It's interesting that you brought up the idea about the talent, making sure that we have folks in the pipeline who are, trained in this field, especially as NJIT, which is a large, university in my district. They, have wonderful programs, and I'm sure would love to partner and collaborate anyway to make sure that we're pumping out, the future employees to be able to, work in this, field. Thank you so much for answering those questions. With that, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields. I'd like to thank Chairman Green, Ranking Member Thompson, and our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes. As my colleagues have discussed the threats of our nation's security and how it has evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated and in many cases more dangerous. Most alarming is the ability of cyber adversaries to cause chaos without even stepping foot on American soil. We have seen reports of adversarial nations, state hackers such as China and North Korea working together to conduct ransomware attacks against global infrastructure. I saw it firsthand as the chairman of the Madison County Commission in Huntsville, Alabama, creating total chaos. And you think about a multi-million-dollar option that we ended up rebuilding our system more cost-effective than paying ransomware. Mr. Montgomery, are you concerned about the cooperation among cyber actors who use the same tactics?
I am. I'm not as concerned about the axis of aggressors yet sharing tools with each other like we see with North Korea providing munitions or troops to to Russia and Ukraine. I am, though, worried that the sophisticated nation-state tools are becoming increasingly available to non-state actors and criminal actors, both in the United States and overseas. I mean, it's not lost on us that Russia's ransomware went down. Russia's ransomware attacks against the rest of the world went down for 3 months after the invasion of Ukraine, because those same ransomware criminals were actually nation-state actors and started to attack Ukraine instead of attack U.S. companies. That's since returned with a vengeance. But what it means is that the nation-state and the criminal actors share tools pretty effectively, and that makes it much tougher on our companies.
Thank you. Although all cyber actors have their own objectives, there's one goal they share, and that's harming the United States of America. Mr. Montgomery, do you foresee the emergence of a cyber axis of evil? Why or why not?
So as I just mentioned, I do think you're seeing it with the criminal actors starting to get tools that the nation-state actors have. Do I think over time they'll share? Yes. If you'd asked me as a military officer 10 years ago, would North Korea send troops to Ukraine? I'd have said no. Would North Korea give up 20 or 30% of its artillery to the Russians? No. The rules have changed. The axis of authoritarians are clearly operating in a much more integrated and aggressive way. It's only natural that this will eventually devolve down to cyber tools and cyber techniques and the sharing of of worst practices in that case.
Nation-state actors appear to be undeterred from targeting us in cyberspace. Whether it's Iran hackers on water systems or PRC state-sponsored threats to critical infrastructure, it is time our national security advisor, you think about it, Mr. Waltz says, and I quote, start going on offense and start imposing higher cost and consequences, close quote. Given the severity and scope of these threats, is it clear that cybersecurity must be at the heart of our Homeland Security strategy?
Yes. I think all four of us in our testimony said that cybersecurity is rapidly becoming the most significant threat to our homeland. And look, there's stiff competition there. Missile attacks, physical attacks, but cyber attacks are clear and present danger today to our industry, to our government, and to our military.
Thank you. Mr. Wells, how can the United States better harness its cyber toolkit to go on offense?
Sure. So U.S. has some amazing capabilities in this area. And I think what we have seen is it works best when it's done in tandem with defensive operations, where we see what the adversary is doing domestically, that information is fed into Cyber Command, and that allows them to target adversaries in a more precise way. It has worked best in places where Cyber Command is targeting, for example, ransomware operators. Because of the number of those attacks, we can quickly provide defensive operators can quickly provide them information on additional targets to go after. But we need to find ways to make sure that that integration is happening so that what they're learning overseas is being fed to defensive operators, and what defensive operators are learning here is being fed into offensive operations.
Thank you. Thank you all. The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Montgomery, you note that Iran, and specifically the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is aggressive in its cyber attacks of Israeli networks. They're also among the primary threats to our networks here. How robust is our cooperation with Israel to assist each other in protecting against this common enemy?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, because Congress did pass an act directing increased and improved cybersecurity cooperation between the United States and Israel about 4 years ago, and we've seen significant improvements. I would say there's tiers of cooperation. Probably the top tier is the United States and the United Kingdom. Through Five Eyes, we have an extensive level, a very integrated level of cooperation, both in cyber and cryptographic intelligence sharing. But I'd put Israel very high on the list. I think we share threat information smoothly and fluidly. Tools that we see, that we detect, we share with each other. Again, probably not on the same level as the United States, United Kingdom, but very close. We have a common shared threat in Iran. Thankfully, the Israelis have done a lot to deter Iranian action over the last 6 months with their extensive strikes into Israel, into Iran, both kinetic and non-kinetic. But yes, our cooperation with them is at the highest level.
I was going to say, I think arguably Israel is in some ways our eyes and ears on the ground, and arguably the roughest neighborhood in the world. And so as you look at our relationship with the United Kingdom, what could or should we be doing with Israel to increase that partnership, understanding we have that common and shared enemy?
So I do think that there's probably a level of classification that we can increase ourselves, of sharing, that we could increase ourselves to even higher. But I would say, I think we do a very good job. And frankly, the Israelis do a great job providing information to us on what they see. Look, this is an alliance in all but paper. We share information closely. We share a common threat. We provide weapons to Israel in a very useful way. So I think we're doing great work. The real order in there is continue what we're doing.
Yes, sir.
And I'll just add, from a defensive perspective, in the post-October 7th, when I was in CISA, we were sharing every single day with the Israeli National Cyber Directorate information on what we were observing in terms of potential actors looking to target Israel. Those were from nation states, non-nation states who were in that environment looking to pile on. And that information sharing was consistent, and it was built on a decades-long relationship that we had established.
Well, Mr. Wells, since you jumped in here, in light of the Silk Typhoon intrusion at the Treasury Department, how would you assess the adequacy of Treasury cybersecurity posture?
So, I think the compromise of Treasury was interesting because, again, going after a third party, in this case, going after a third party security application beyond trust, I think Treasury's security has dramatically improved, just like much of the federal government over the past 8 years. But what I would say is we're forcing adversaries to go after more complex targets and launch more complex operations, in this case, again, using a third-party supply chain attack, which is good, but it also puts increased burden on us as a country to make sure that we're looking for those more complex attacks, that we're managing third-party risk, that we're understanding how they can use supply chains to target our most critical systems, and what we can and what we should expect from technology providers to ensure that their software and the technology that they provide to both government and industry is as secure as possible.
Well, in that context, when we look at the third-party providers, and obviously there's a vulnerability there, in respect to Treasury and other agencies, how do they compare in mitigating that risk as you're forced to integrate and provide technologies for the consumer and for governments, et cetera?
I would refer you to people who are in government now who may have a better sense of where Treasury stacks up, but I will say that when I last was impressed with their level of capability.
Yes, sir. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I want to recognize Mr. Burkeen from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to just lay out some numbers. I think it's intriguing. Cybersecurity hacks are costing us, according to some reports, $320 billion a year. That's unto U.S. citizens. That's about 1% of our GDP, our gross domestic product. As it's been talked about, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea. And at the individual level, people have to worry about their bank accounts. You have statistics that say that 1 in 3 Americans have been affected by healthcare data breaches alone just in 2024. And so there's so much to gain, not only from our national security being hindered, but as Mr. Wells, you said in your testimony, they are preparing for war, talking about China and their desire as it pertains to Taiwan. I want to throw an interesting concept out. The Constitution actually talks about in Article 1, Section 8, something called letters of marquee and reprisal. This is something that's not I alone am talking about. This is something that goes back to even legislation that was filed a few years ago. And if you think about when you all have been talking about we've got to go on the offensive, we all recognize we've got a massive debt. There's a limitation to how much we can spend. And throughout our nation's history, Letters of marquee and reprisal were the opportunity for people that, knowing that private entities were being attacked, our government would issue very limited in scope information for private entities to go out and be able to capture, to hack back, and it was applied to this scenario, versus waiting on government to respond. Sometimes if you're a security firm trying to defend a private company, and as the saying goes, in terms of companies right now, there's two types of companies in this world, those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. There's a delay. Why would we not empower the free market to hack back under very specified, regulated rules, constitutional in every manner, letters of marquee and reprisal, go on the offense, and employ what we know are really intelligent people in the technology entity, and we make it hard for people to want to go after America. That they know that if they hack Americans under these very specific details, having to identify where the hack came from, that CISA could be involved with, we immediately hit back, and it is a great deterrent for aggression from foreign nations. I've got about 2 minutes left. Who would like to speak to that?
Well, I'll start only because I'm from the Navy, and the last the last ship seizure was, I think, by the Navy in World War II under a similar theory. What I'll say is, I would prefer that we actually developed a cyber force that could do this, where we were robust enough. So I first have to acknowledge that the right long-term answer, just like it was with special forces after 9/11, was to grow our special forces to be the force we needed. In the short term, on occasion, you may need to use contractors to bridge yourself to that point, but I think the long-term preference is that we have military actors. Now, to get at your point, those military actors in a cyber force don't have to be wearing a uniform, and we don't have to recruit people that look like Chairman Crane looked like when he first joined the Navy. They can be a little overweight. They can have an unusual drug usage recently.
I've got limited time,
So I would say I would go for that. In the absence of that, we need to look at the use of contractor elements through this. I would not go to independent companies.
All right, let me, because this has been cited. People say, well, that you would open up the Wild West. It's already the Wild West already. And somebody would say, well, you don't know what would happen if you did that. Don't you think that's what the founding era, when they issued letters of marquee and reprisal, had to worry about, is somebody unintentionally that shouldn't be impacted? Of course they did. So for anybody that says there's a risk to this, you're right. But our founders knew on open waters there was the same amount of risk. The problem is, I contend, we're in a place where we think government is the solution to everything, and that's why we have a $36 trillion gross national debt. And we've got a limitation on fiscal resources. I love what you're saying. Some of you come from a government background, but maybe we don't need to just be looking at the status quo. Our founding fathers knew there were risks with this, but they put it in our Constitution, and they were brilliant. Anybody else want to talk about this?
Agreeing with Mr. Montgomery here, I would caution that there is higher potential collateral damage as a result of uncoordinated.
Can I interrupt you? Is there anybody who's willing to think outside the box on this? Not from a government background. Do you not think the founding fathers also thought this thing through and knew, it could be dangerous to empower privateers to go do this? But they did it. Think about Dunkirk. There's a time when government can't solve all your problems, and they hire or ask 800 boats to go help out. Dunkirk would have been a collapse absent utilizing the free market.
I think I'm far enough outside the box recommending for a 7th Military Service, a cyber force, so I'm going to leave myself.
I'm pushing pretty hard, but we've got to think outside the box, the limitation of federal expenditure. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you guys for showing up today. It's unfortunate that we don't have the FBI and anybody from Homeland Security here to testify before the committee. You guys have all discussed numerous attempts to, and even successfully, infiltrate by our adversaries to hack into our critical infrastructure. We've been talking about our healthcare system today, the power grid, water infrastructure, corporate infrastructure, federal agencies, etc. I know Director Wray of the FBI has even been up here in front of Congress testifying along these lines. I believe his quote was, "Chinese hackers are positioned on American infrastructure in preparation to wreak havoc and cause real-world harm to American citizens and communities if and when China decides the time has come to strike." One thing that my constituents often ask me is why is nobody in the federal government ever held accountable for their failures? And I want to point out that I believe it was you, Mr. Myers, from CrowdStrike. You actually appeared before this very committee in the last Congress and actually took accountability for some of your company's failures. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
Knowing that, and that's one of the things that the American people are so frustrated about with the federal government. Nobody ever gets accountable. Rarely does anybody take any ownership of their failures. Mr. Myers, do you think some of your counterparts from the federal government today should take some ownership of some of the failures that have led to many of our adversaries acquiring access to our critical infrastructure that we've been talking about today? Would you like to see that?
I would like to see us move to a position where we're able to stop these things before they happen.
Okay, so you don't want to see any accountability? Mr. Myers, you don't want to see any government officials maybe sitting on this panel today take some ownership?
My role here is to...
Gotcha, thank you. To that point, I want to give some of the other members on this panel the opportunity to take some ownership of some of the failures that have allowed the Chinese and others to hack into some of our critical infrastructure. Does anybody want to take any ownership since you guys have been doing this for a very long time? I'll start with you, Mr. Wells.
So I would say that when I was in government, we were very clear about where we needed to make improvements, where there were failings, where we had not invested enough in the right areas, where we needed to make changes. I would say if I look back at, because I was acting director at the time, as the SolarWinds campaign had emerged, was discovered, we identified that the federal government for too long had overinvested in some areas of network security and underinvested in endpoint monitoring. Came to Congress and said, we need new authorities to do this, we need additional funding, here is how we fix these problems because we were not in the right place. And since then, we have made dramatic improvements in the overall level of security. So I think where we've needed to be honest about the lack of capability in certain areas that has allowed certain attacks to happen, we've been clear about that.
Ms. Walden, how about you?
I was part of the apparatus that created the Office of the National Cyber Director so that, in the famous words of Senator King, Congress would have one throat to choke when something went down. I think what Mr. Wales said was absolutely true. We made movements to make sure that we are all singing off the same sheet of music, playing the same soccer game, whatever analogy you want. But I think the failure was a lack of coordination for some time.
Do you take any ownership in that, Ms. Walden?
And the lack of coordination?
Yeah.
I will own that I've worked to make sure that we had better coordination.
So none. Okay, thank you. Are you guys, Mr. Wells, are you familiar with this report, the weaponization of CISA, how a cybersecurity agency colluded with big tech and disinformation partners to censor Americans? I believe this was the Judiciary Committee.
Yes.
Mr. Wells, do you think it's appropriate to silence Americans for pointing out anomalies, data, and policy changes in, our last election or any election? Do you think that's appropriate for you guys to silence Americans?
I think Americans have free speech rights and they can say what they want.
Okay. When you were in charge of CISA, did you ever oversee the censorship of any Americans for whatever views they might have held, whether you agreed with them or not?
No.
No? Okay. We've been talking today about some of the things that we can do to increase and bolster our cybersecurity efforts. And I agree. I do think that we need to go on the offensive. I believe it was you, Mr. Montgomery, you talked about, if we had foreign state actors placing satchel charges and explosives on our energy grid or anywhere else, we would raise holy hell and it would be an act of war. My question to you guys, my final question is, why aren't we doing it?
Oh, sir, I think for too long, we've seen cyber as a non-military tool. And we just, we saw it as a nuisance and criminal actor tool. And that has dampened our response. as I pointed out, satchel charges, you and I'd be leading the charge to go find out who did this and hold them accountable. I just think with cyber, we take on this tempered approach that it doesn't kill people, even though we now know it does kill people. There are morbidity rates at hospitals that increase because of ransomware attacks. We know this. Look, it's a attitudinal change. I think on a bipartisan basis 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't see things this way. I hope on a bipartisan basis going forward, we can see that we need to go on the offensive and hold a country that does this kind of operational preparation of the battlefield against the United States accountable for their actions.
I got one more follow-up question. Mr. Wells, if you weren't censoring American citizens in CISA, why was it going on?
I don't believe it was.
So you completely disagree with this report? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
And you're under oath today?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back. The real chairman is now back.
Thanks. First, let me say thanks to the witnesses for being here. Ranking Member, I think it's time to recognize you for a closing statement. I mean, is there something?
Yeah, I'd like to enter something into
Oh,
the
yeah, absolutely.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a report entitled Cybersecurity Policy Recommendations for the New Administration from the Aspen Institute.
So ordered.
And let me, just as a final point, thank our witnesses. It's been very good. We're almost on track, but we're getting there. I want you all to work with us. Again, I compliment the chairman on looking at this as a priority for the committee. We will get there. And I just think that we have to plow through it in order to get to the finish line. And we ask your indulgence, and if you have something that I think is of note for the committee to consider, I'd encourage you to share it with us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you for your comments on just the bipartisan nature of this. It is really one team on this one because this is critically important. I want to thank the witnesses. All of you have been fantastic, pretty much echoing each other's comments, which that's a good slate of witnesses when that happens. I also want to thank the members for their thoughtful comments on both sides. I have stated my priorities on the cyber arena, and I want to, since this is our first hearing and because it's our first hearing on cyber, I want to restate those. You know, I think our greatest issue, our greatest threat to the country is the workforce shortage. And when we have 500,000 empty jobs, when the FBI director comes in front of our committee and testifies that if he took every single cyber person he had, put them on the China desk, he'd still be outnumbered 50-1, that circumstance can't continue. And that's why we'll be reintroducing the Pivot Act, and I really appreciate many of you have mentioned it, and if not by name, all of you have talked about it, the need for that. And then this harmonization of what's out there in the government. I think we're spending a lot of time, especially our private industry, and we all know that much of our infrastructure is managed by our private businesses. I think the Rear Admiral mentioned that specifically in his testimony. You know, we ask of our private businesses all these different things, and every agency publishes things, and oftentimes they contradict one another. And there's this compliance checklist and this compliance checklist, and they wind up spending all this time on compliance when they really should be spending time on cybersecurity. And so finding a way forward to harmonize the government regulations that are in this space, I think will free up a lot of energy and money to do cybersecurity. And I can give example after example, but we talked about the liability issue. I think, Ms. Walden, you brought that piece of it up. On the one hand, we're granting one group liability, and then the SEC is telling people, yeah, okay, it takes 7 days to repair a breach, but you have to tell your shareholders and make it a public announcement in 4 days. Well, why would you announce in 4 days that you got a breach when it takes 7 to fix it? Just some of this stuff that's coming out of the bureaucracy and maybe even out of Congress too, just has to be harmonized and synchronized, and that's my second priority. My third priority is we've got to rethink, and this is why I asked each of you this, and I'm reiterating my question for your written feedback on how we address the economic models in the production of our software and our technology, because first to market is creating vulnerabilities that are costing the government, right, as a vendor, and costing private industry billions of dollars a year. And we have to get to a place, I don't know if it's certification, I don't know, there are multiple courses of action here. Liability could be one. I mean, I know the businesses don't want to hear that, right, Mr. Myers? It's okay, it's my turn. But I understand, I ran a healthcare company. I get being first to market, it's a competitive advantage, but man, if you throw that piece of software out there and you rushed it to market and man, it's got a hole in it, we could all be screwed. So we have to figure out how to reverse this economic model. And another converse economic model is the fact that it takes $3,000 and a laptop in Russia for a punk kid to get $5 million out of a rural nursing home. That economic, he has no risk. He's not going to be extradited to the United States. We have to fix that economic model and make it more expensive for him or her to hack us than a $3,000 laptop in the security of a foreign country that isn't friendly to the United States. So the economic models have to be adjusted. We will reenact the cyber subcommittees thing that I started last cycle, where we get the various subcommittees of each of, we're siloed in Congress. The government's siloed, we're siloed in this whole cyber thing. We got cyber subcommittees in financial services. We got cyber subcommittees in, HAS. We got our cyber. We try to get those together. We got them together last year on about a quarterly basis. We'll try that again. We're going to start that process again and start thinking a whole of government approach to cyber. And I might ask all of you at some point to come back and talk and present what you did today to that cyber subs group, because we really do need a whole of government approach. And I agree on the unity of command issue that you mentioned, Admiral. That is critical. I spent 24 years in the military and studied the principles of war at West Point, so I get that, and you're right. Clearly defining who's in charge, that's really us, right? In Congress, defining those authorities, and so we'll work on that too. One of the things that kind of worries me a little bit is, if you use chemical weapons against the United States, we have a written strategic response to that. If you use nuclear weapons, we have a first use nuclear, right? So we don't have a cyber response strategy. If you hit the United States, this is what's going to happen to you. And I hope the new administration will take that issue on and come out with a statement that says, if you do X, we will do Y. And it's well known and articulated throughout the world, because you can have all the capability in the world, if you don't have willpower to use it, then it just doesn't matter. There were some comments made about Secretary Noem's refusal to take some federal dollars. I just want to mention that is not a reflection of her commitment to cybersecurity. She just believes in federalism, and she spent millions of South Dakotan dollars to create this program of cybersecurity in her own state, implying that she somehow is opposed to cybersecurity, cyber protection, because she chose not to take federal dollars, I think is a mistake. The members of the committee can also ask additional questions to you, and they have a few days to do so, and I ask that you guys respond in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for such for 10 days. Thank you again, and without objection, This committee stands adjourned.